We'll have access to Bob a little later when we go into the general questions. Before moving to Elaine, a few words about this space, if you don't mind. My wife Frida and other members of the family here, we've shared a lot in the territory of this chapel. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, St. Paul's Chapel became the relief center for the recovery workers at Ground Zero, just out that door. It was a refuge of care, feeding, and solace for recovery workers over the entire 9 months of cleanup. In 2005, an organization, the Community of the Cross of Nails, which arose out of World War II, and more specifically, the bombing of Coventry Cathedral in England by the Germans and of Dresden by the Allies, designated St. Paul's Chapel as a special place for reconciliation. Part of today's symposium will focus on reconciliation, racial and generational. There is no better spot for this effort. I should start the discussion of the journey to Elaine with the concept of regrettable unknowing. Monticello, Arkansas, where I lived most of my life until I went away to college when I was almost 18, is located in the southeast region of the state, only one county away from Phillips County, where the Elaine Race Massacre occurred. Further, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, before integration of the school systems there, I went back to Monticello and taught in the all-African American public school. One could rightly assume that based on the duality of those experiences, I had learned most of the history of race relations in that area of the state. Indeed, I had also taken Arkansas history during my youth and knew Southern history reasonably well, I thought. In 2008, after reaching the age of 60, I was asked by the Episcopal Church, as a number of you are aware, to write the litany of offense and apology in prose and poetry for the National Day of Repentance, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I worked on that litany, I reread and renewed my familiarity with writers like W.E. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells Barnett, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright, among others. But it was Ida B. Wells Barnett, the anti-lynching advocate and historian, who brought me to startledom when I discovered a small volume of 60 pages she had authored on the Elaine Race Massacre. Yes, in Arkansas. Yes, in nearby Elaine. She described the deaths of so many African Americans, the trials, the verdicts and penalties meted out by the local courts, her trips from Chicago to the Walls Penitentiary outside of Little Rock, when she posed as a family member of one of the prisoners to get access to the Elaine 12, who were repeatedly scheduled for execution, including Sheila's forebear, Albert Giles. I reached out to former high school classmates and asked them what they knew about the Elaine Race Massacre. Nothing. I never heard it discussed in family circles or in casual conversations at Monticello cafes or coffee shops or at church or social gatherings. Nothing. Anger was my immediate reaction to this regrettable unknowing. Of course, there had been an abundance of reasons to keep silent about it on both sides. The old saw that the more one picks at a scab, the worse it bleeds, was repeatedly employed as a reason for not revisiting the massacre. Enough blood flowed from the scab of racism. Later, I read Bob Whitaker's definitive work on the lapse of gods and other pieces about Elaine, but it was Bob's more expansive book. Like a piece of spiritual text, that held revelatory effects. A book that began to unlock well-kept secrets. Well-kept secrets. Some maybe that I could have preferred on a personal level or two, still buried. However, if I weren't interested in seeing them all unburied, then what made me any different from those who had thought for decades that Elaine, left alone, constituted the best course? Pieces coming together, such as the various roles of employees from the Missouri Pacific Railroad during and after the massacre that included supplementing local law enforcement and the torturing of prisoners held in the Phillips County Jail. The white posses that gathered from surrounding communities and states to repel a conjured black insurrection. The headquarters of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union being located only 6 miles away from a family farm. The killing fields for the African American sharecroppers and their families right next to the railroad tracks outside of Elaine. And so much more. Much more. Pieces coming together. My father died of cancer when I was 1. Since my mother couldn't cope very well for the next several years, until about the time I was to enter the 1st grade, I lived during that interim with my maternal grandparents, Lonnie and Hattie Birch. My names for them always being Lonnie and Hattie. My only other sibling, an older brother, filled much of that period with our paternal grandparents. Lonnie had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad and occupied his days, as I recollect, caring for and being with me. I recall many hours in his lap on the front porch, watching cars and people go by. A porch chair could be overturned and magically, shortly after the end of World War II, become a fighter pilot's cockpit. Lonnie and I took long walks together. We celebrated birthdays, Easter, Christmas together. When I fell down, he picked me up and gently assuaged my scrapes and bruises. There is a single dominant figure in my memory from those early years, Lonnie. I never once remember his raising his voice or correcting anything I ever did. In 1919, at the time of the Elaine Race Massacre, Lonnie lived and worked as a railroad engineer for the Missouri Pacific Railroad in McGee, within Deshay County, immediately south of Phillips County, site of the massacre. He also had an interest in the Birch family farm that was located in the northern part of Deshay County, though his brothers did the actual farming there. McGee was the hub for the railroad company's operation in that area of the state, and the launching point for most who would make their way to Elaine, including the federal soldiers. It had not been a secret Lonnie belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Stories circulated within the family how he rose some nights and put on his sheet and hood, coming back several hours later, never discussing what had occurred. A couple of years before I entered high school, out of the blue, without provocation or for any apparent reason, while she was driving me someplace, Mother casually mentioned Lonnie had participated in what she called, ironically, when reviewed in retrospect, a well-known race riot while in the employ of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Later on, she editorialized from time to time how Lonnie traveled on a train from McGee to the battle between the races. Bloody engagement with the blacks had been near the railroad tracks, presumably also close to the train which he had driven or on which he had been an occupant. Looking back on the history of the time when the Elaine Race Massacre happened, what other race massacre or so-called race riot had there been near McGee, except for Elaine? There weren't any. Yes, history disclosed there were lynchings or the burning alive of African Americans about that time in Star City, Monticello, McGee, and Lake Village within southeast Arkansas, but no massacre or riot, except for Elaine. In the 4-part article I wrote on this subject for Green Mountains Review, I used conditional words like Lonnie's likely or probable participation in the massacre. A few months ago, Bob Whitaker joined me for dinner, and we talked extensively about the evidence surrounding Lonnie's likely or probable role. After going through it all in detail, I walked away from dinner knowing I could continue to use likely or probable, but considering the preponderant evidence, it was my own peculiar patina to employ those conditional words which lay on top of and shadow the real truth, that Lonnie did indeed participate in the Elaine race massacre. In my readings that dealt with the period in which the massacre happened, I recollect references to that region of Arkansas at the time as the heart of darkness, as Joseph Conrad empowered the phrase. And it may have been, with my own grandfather's propensity adding in goodly supply, no doubt, to the pool of darkness that spread murderously and perniciously over the land. Yet he was kind to me and protected me at my most vulnerable age and stage. I will not try to resolve the two lines. It would be false, serpentine, and artificial to try. Still, I know unreservedly my own path to Elaine was in part to discover a slice of him that still baffles and repulses my personal conscience. In August 2012, an official and friend from the University of Arkansas, who was also a friend of David Solomon, joined me in Phillips County. As we walked and rode by and through the killing fields and adjacent areas in the fierce and thick summer sun and August Arkansas humidity, we held an eerie notion we could be surveying a concealed factor in our country's genome. At the time, two related conclusions came to mind. First, little change to most of the landscape or along the narrow dirt roads had taken place since 1919. Though the sharecropper shacks and some of the wooded spots and coppices where African Americans hid themselves from both the white posses and the federal troops had completely disappeared, replaced by expanded farmland. Second, no one ever intended to set any historical reminder in that place, a marker of explanation, a monument, a memorial of any kind, so future generations could know with a degree of certainty that several whites and more than 100 and perhaps hundreds of African Americans died in humble and unremarkable fields and in like spaces within Phillips County as part of one of the most important racial confrontations in our country's history. In my quest to cite an existential piece of Lonnie among the ruins of the Elaine race massacre, I had, after all, concluded history to be doubtless. Too much and too little abided in the fields and fury of Phillips County for Lonnie and me to inhabit any amicable turf there. Too much intervening and unsympathetic time, too much dismay as I turned the leaves of record, which bore too much dissent and strife and turpitude, too little comity, too little heart. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there exists an overarching tenet that the individual will must express itself morally, that is, in one form or another, good or bad. In that respect, the most immediate and constant form of expression of that morality lies in the social dimension or our behavior toward each other. Not because our neighbors are simply ciphers for God, but because we are all individually worthy of love. That we can and should love others as we love ourselves. An obstacle to this higher moral achievement in our expressions toward one another in America, generation after generation, consists of implacable racism that rises repeatedly, 400 years and going strong. Why don't we learn? Why can't we learn? Why do the Fergusons or worse occur repeatedly? Rosanna Warren, daughter of the famous Southern writer Robert Penn Warren, and renowned writer in her own right, recently sent me a note on the relevance of this symposium, saying this excerpt: "It is very important that Trinity is hosting this symposium. In the face of our monstrous amnesia, we need to keep refreshing our sense of the human. Yes, yes, and yes," close quote. In a very much related comment, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote 150 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn anew in each generation that which is genuinely human. I'm nearly 70, and I've come to believe that Rosanna Warren and Kierkegaard are right. We alone open up ourselves to the genuinely human. That is what we can do. That is our grace as humans. Otherwise, we are continually plagued by that eternal no, N-O, which we sometimes call evil or sin, if you will, of which racism is an elemental part. A few months ago, through the good and kind efforts of Bob Whitaker, Sheila Walker and I made contact for the first time. Our initial conversation consisted of a telephone call that lasted about 2 hours. I remember Frida coming in at one point and passing a note, asking me if everything was okay. Yes, it was all right. It was more than all right. Sheila and I had indeed known each other for a very long time, even though we had never met. It was the first contact. It was the contact we wished our forebears could have had instead of the inferno our antecedents had mutually shared. One as an instrument of a merciless onslaught against the other, the murdered and brutalized. By the time we hung up the telephone, I think we both realized we had known each other for 100 years. I knew Sheila's family, who resided in the area that would become part of the killing fields. Sally Giles and her 2 sons, Albert, who had been hunted down and shot several times, and 15-year-old Milligan, whom Smitty, a security official from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, shot in the face. I knew those in Sheila's family who could not bear to talk about the Elaine race massacre without trembling and sobbing. By the end of our call, she recognized and acknowledged the 2 sides of Lonnie, although she had seen him before in 1,000 different costumes and settings. A few weeks ago, or a few weeks later, we met in person at the home of her son Marcus and her daughter-in-law Francie in Boston. As soon as I walked in the front door, Sheila and I embraced for a very long time. And you can look at Ferguson and say those similarities existed in Elaine. And what are they? One being this irrational fear that Bob went through in some detail. And then this exaggerated response. I mean, you know, the policeman who shot Michael Brown 6 times, and Michael Brown not having any gun. There's that aspect of the exaggerated response. And then there's the institutional arrogance that always rises. I mean, in Elaine, you know, you had more than 100, maybe hundreds of African Americans. No whites were ever arrested or put in trial or put in jail or anything like that. And Ferguson, you had the ability, or some people in the institutional world had the ability, they didn't have the ability to fill out an incident report, but they had the ability to go to find a tape that showed Brown lifting a few cigars. I mean, to me, that comments to the institutional arrogance that is another face of racism. And then the other part being that of the insensitivity. As I think I indicated at the beginning, there was this, observers said that African Americans were stacked like cordwood. And then Ferguson, we had Michael Brown out there for 4 hours. Lack of sensitivity. And I would actually say that if you look at most racial incidents over history, they would all carry those 4 characters. Sorry. Wait, I'm sorry.
Hi, Chester. Hi. This is more a comment than really a question. I know you, I worship with you, I've worked on committees with you, and I have to say, this is maybe the most beautiful narrative I've ever heard. It's so painful hearing this whole story of what happened, what took place. But I guess the most compelling thing is that you're an ancestor who, your life has been just dedicated to unity and serving God. For you to stand up there and acknowledge what took place through your own ancestry, it just feels so good. I'm really choked up because I think, well, I can speak for this black man, just for you to acknowledge that pain. It means everything.
I'm jumping up too.
That's a hard question to follow, but I'm actually going to follow it with a question with a broader lens about what's going on today in our world that relates to this beyond things like Ferguson. I'm talking about our political structure. In 2008, we elected our first African-American president. I think most of us in here were thrilled and were hopeful that we were going to see a period of change. And in fact, we've seen a period of fighting that change with lots of money. The Supreme Court has declared corporations to be citizens, and we have groups like the Koch brothers, we have Wall Street, which is the darker side, I guess, of Trinity. I mean, it's part of our history and heritage. And my question really is about what's going on now with the gerrymandering, it's not as blatant as Ferguson, but it's more insidious. The racist sort of thing that is transpiring with all these Tea Party, crazy, extremist, right-wing, racist groups that have a loud voice. And I'm hoping that their voices are overcome by your testimony and our good faith. But I have a real concern about what we have coming in the next election, with particularly the gerrymandering of voting to keep people from voting. Like one state, I can't remember which state it is, has decided that they won't accept out-of-state ballots anymore. And all sorts of things like that about IDs for people. I know this is sort of a little off topic, but
the only thing I can say, John, in response to that, because an individual doesn't necessarily have particular ability to make wholesale changes in terms of how things are gerrymandered or whatever. My initial response to that is what I said in my remarks. That is, picking up what Rosanna Warren and Kierkegaard said, that every generation has, well, individuals make the decision, but we don't really, we believe that previous generations somehow teach us. I'm talking about the genuinely human, the stuff where you live in your gut, where your spiritual life talks to. And all I can say is, that while all this may be going, all this noise that may be going on around us, it is that sort of personal grace to be able to work toward the genuinely human that makes us whatever we are. One more.
Thank you, Chester.
Yes, sir.
I applaud your courage, first of all, because you easily could have uncovered this about your family, your beloved grandfather. You could have sat on it, and nobody would have made you the less. Well, that's my grandfather. I can't talk about him. I applaud your courage, first of all. And then my question is, how do you relate to your family? How do you? I don't mean your family that you have created. I mean to your descendants. Your mother, your father, your paternal grandparents, your aunt. How do you relate to them? Can you look at them face to face? And what kind of stories about your descendants do you have?
Thank you. That's a great question. One of the advantages that I have is that I'm an orphan. I mean, I have known my parents. I mean, they're long gone, and I only have one older brother, and he still lives in Lake Village, Arkansas, which is way down in the southeast part of the state. And even though I've told him about the article that I wrote, which is much more extensive than this, I don't think he's ever read it. I don't think he'd want to read it. And there have been times we went for several years not talking because he sent me a lot of information during the first time that Obama ran for office. And I asked him, I said, I love hearing about you and your family, but quit sending me that stuff. And he then sent me a long letter and said, we're going to meet on the other side. But the next time that you can talk to me, I don't want to hear from you again. You can talk to me on the other side. And for several years, that's the way it's been. And then about, say maybe eight months ago, he sent me a letter and said, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't mean to do it. And we've sort of tried together. So it's not easy, but what we are comfortable, where we feel where we are, where we really live, and so anyway, that and he's the only relative that I really have a deep nature in Arkansas.
Can we just take one more? She had her hand up for a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wondered from either you or Mr. Whitaker, what role women played besides hiding in a ditch during that massacre?
Bob has a lot more knowledge on that subject. So I'll let you want to respond to it. I have one thing I want to read before I let it go. But no, you get this and I'll go.
Well, actually, Sheila's going to talk a little bit. Sheila's going to talk a little bit about this, how they handle to the men in prison. This goes a little bit to history, though, too, because what you do hear about, so the men get rounded up, the women do not. There is a little bit of information about how the women then returned home and found that their homes, their small cabins had been ransacked, etc. And then that they're now in a horrible position. Their men are locked up or dead. And they're now no money, houses have been ransacked, but there is information about them sort of staying around trying to support their men during the time of the trials. Then they disappear. By this I mean you can't track what happens to that population. You can imagine they want to leave, right? This was what was, you just can't track it. So the honest answer to you is they're sort of peripheral characters. Now Sally's so central, interestingly, because she shows up in the church right away, they meet around her house, so she's clearly an important part of the community. But one of the tough parts of this story is, in fact, like what happened to the community afterwards. They just disappeared. I couldn't even find him in the 1930 census. Really, they just gone. You can't find him in phone books, nothing. It tells you a lot about the status of that population. They go all over. This is what was so amazing when Sheila got to touch with me. It was the first time I heard a story of a whole family and how it was affected and going forward in history. Your question is a great one. The truth of the matter is it goes again to how history is told. We have a story basically what happened to the black men, and we have a white story. But the white women just are very, very peripheral. I will say one thing. One of the best records of what happened economically comes from a woman. It's Ida B. Wells Barnett. Yeah. If you read that pamphlet, she talks about money, how many acres they had, how many cows they had, how much money they would have gotten. And that's where we do get a little sense of the domestic life that was completely disrupted.
Thank you.
Sheila is up.
You hear me?
Sheila is up next. I just want to underscore, Sheila has really unlocked a lot of chapters in the Elaine story. And there's no question that she will unlock a lot more in the future.
That it should be. Everyone can hear me now.
No, I can't hear.
Can't. Okay, can you hear me now? No. Leave it back there. Okay, I'm going to try to speak as loud as I can. This is, I think, about the height of how loud I can speak. I first heard about the Elaine riots, or knew that something went on in my family in 1973. My husband, my son, and brother-in-law took a trip to Arkansas. I was born in Arkansas, Hot Springs, to visit my grandmother. And my grandmother started to tell a story about having a premonition that something bad, that someone was going to shoot into a church. There was a meeting at a church that she was attending. And so she kind of got to gather the children together, and they went towards the back of the church. And as she's talking about this, she gets really re-stimulated with the events that happened in Elaine that night, with the shooting into the church, people dropping to the floor, and she goes into hysterics, and I don't get the story. Over the years, I tried to get that same story from my grandmother. She would get to that certain point where she's overwhelmed, goes into hysterics, and I never get that story. And she dies in 1991 without me even knowing what she was ever talking about. Somewhere around 92 or 93, I asked my mother, what is it that I called my grandmother Mama, that Mama was talking about, and she would just get all hysterical about. And my mother says, oh, she was trying to tell you about the Elaine riot. And I asked my mother, well, what is that? She says, well, I didn't get much of that story myself, so I really don't know. And about the same time, we had just invested in a computer and went on the internet, so I started searching how the Elaine riots, and I put in all kind of different things. And it came up, and there were some old Phillips County newspaper articles, and it was speaking about the insurrection of the sharecroppers against the farmers and how they were put down, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going through these articles, and I'm going over from October the 1st was the first article, October the 2nd, October the 3rd, and I see a name, a last name that I recognize. My grandmother's her maiden name was Giles, Giles. And I see this name of one of the people that was captured, started giving evidence, testifying against, or not testifying, but giving statements against those sharecroppers that were involved in who killed who. And the name was Milligan Giles. So I call my mother up and I ask her, who's Milligan? I've never heard of this Milligan Giles. Who is this person? There's a Giles mentioned. I'm looking at these articles and there's a Giles mentioned, but who's Milligan? And she says, oh, that's your Uncle Jim. And I says, Uncle Jim? I always thought Uncle Jim's name was James. So she says, no, his name is Milligan, I guess middle name James Giles, but they all called him Jim. So Uncle Jim gave testimony and he pointed out who was involved after he was captured in the Elaine riots. Wow, that's nothing to be really proud of, you know. Then there came a, periodically I would just kind of look it up to see if there was any more information. And then there was a book that came out by Grief Stockley, a lawyer, an Arkansas lawyer. And I immediately bought that book, read that book, and it gave facts, and it gave what the climate of Arkansas was, and it mentioned my Uncle Albert, and it mentioned my Uncle Jim Milligan. It mentioned their names in it and what, you know, where they were, maybe where they were shot and et cetera. And it talks about the Moore versus Dempsey trial and how the NAACP was involved in this case. I read the book, facts, put it down, and then I started talking to my mother about it. And I started talking to my children about it. And my daughter, who was in undergrad, said, Mom, there's a book being written. There was a book being written about it. Either one of her professors or a friend of hers mentioned the book, On the Lapse of God. She said, you should get that book and read it. And I did. And that's the book that Bob wrote. That book spoke to me. It was a more personal story of what happened to the sharecroppers. It kind of gave a more rounded picture of what happened. that night on September the 30th and then some of the ensuing days afterwards. Now, I read this book and I put it down. And last year, a sister of mine passed away. This is my second sister who died, my youngest sister. And I was just sitting in reflection. I had just read a book by Isabel Wilkinson called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's about the Great Migration. And what touched me about that is that how families from the South had to escape to the North to keep from a family member from being lynched. It wasn't just the oppression of Jim Crow, but actually, just getting out because of life-threatening incidents that might be happening in the family. And I was planning on doing a presentation at a group. We have something called Culture Share, and I was going to speak about the Elaine riots. And so on that same table was Bob's book, On the Lapse of Gods. And something just called at me and said, here you've grown up in poverty, and you've tried throughout your life to fight that whole thing. And I'm trying to link these two books together, and something just says, get in touch with him. See if you can get in touch. I look him up on the computer, and I see the other books that he's written, and he's spoken around the world on another issue, not this particular book. And I'm just overwhelmed. And I just get on the computer and I said, maybe there's an email address somewhere for him. And I find it. And I emailed him. And the title of my email is that I am the granddaughter of Sally Giles, or the Elaine 12. And on the top right-hand side, on my right-hand side, the second person from the right is a person that I have identified as my Uncle Albert. Now there's a little background, we'll go back, about Uncle Albert. When I was a child, born in Arkansas, in Hot Springs, I would hear about an uncle being sentenced to the electric chair. Very young. And I didn't know what the electric chair was, but I knew that it couldn't be something good, an electric chair, you hear that. And I didn't hear any more about it, so that just kind of stayed back in the back of my head. And so when I read the story, I said, maybe that was a reference. That was a reference that my grandmother and great-grandmother were making about my Uncle Albert. And I had also heard that Uncle Jim was sent to a work farm, it was a prison farm actually. And he served the time until Scipio Africanus Jones got all of those people released from those that were sentenced on second-degree murder. He was charged with second-degree murder. So getting back to Bob emailed me within 12 hours of me sending that email, stating that I was the first descendant from the Arkansas 12 to ever get in touch with him, other than someone on the other side. And I knew that he meant Lonnie. I hadn't met Lonnie or whatever. And when I met Bob, the first thing he asked me was, would you like to meet that person? I said, yes, I would like to meet that person that reached out to you and said that he had a descendant that was involved with the Elaine riots. Never discussed in my family. Like those were little snippets of what was discussed. I started asking my mother any questions. My mother would come up with little things that her grandmother told her, which is Sally Giles. I have a picture of my great-grandmother, Sally Giles. And Sally would tell her about the women being allowed to go into the jails to dress the wounds of their loved ones. And that was something I was like, they actually allowed the women to take care of the men. This is my great-grandmother, Sally Giles. I don't know when that picture was taken, what year it was taken, but she was a very strong woman, a strong matriarch. She left my great-grandfather, Milligan Alberts, and my grandmother, Annie's father. She had 4 children, and she took Milligan, Albert, and Andy with her to Arkansas to sharecrop. They were originally from Louisiana, Lake Providence, Louisiana, and that's how they started sharecropping. So she would go in and dress the wounds of her 2 sons. And that's really all I know that she did. I think there was another incident that my mother said that her grandmother told her about soldiers coming to her cabin. And that must have been right after the massacre, asking where her sons were. And she just sat on the porch with her arms folded and said, I have no idea where they are, and just left it at that. In Bob's book, he mentioned that the neighbor next door, I guess people witnessed him being killed by either the posse or soldiers, I'm not sure which. The wounds that she took care of, and my mother used to say, it was their hind parts, meaning their buttocks, their back, and their legs that were beaten. And apparently, with the electric chair, I didn't know that happened, that apparently that electric chair, the torture in the electric chair, was part of, the wounds were also part of that as well. And the torturing was inflicted to get someone to testify. And I guess Milligan being the youngest of them, they started with him first, being 15 years old. So they started with him first. My grandmother, I couldn't get much information out of her. Like I said, it was just really, really, really re-stimulating. I would have liked to have just sat down and had a real conversation with her, try to get her through the re-stimulation to find out what her point of view of what happened. How does she feel? How scared she was with them shooting in and people dropping to the floor and seeing people get killed in that church. Some people did get killed in that church. As far as my Uncle Albert, after he was released from prison as part of the Arkansas 12, he wasn't with the Moore versus Dempsey case. So they only used 6 men with the Moore versus Dempsey case. And the other 6, they held all of them in jail. But those 6 men were eventually the 6 that weren't involved with the Supreme Court decision, their sentences were commuted by the government before he left office. Uncle Albert, as far as I know, after he was released, left the state of Arkansas. And the next history that I heard about him was in Springfield, Illinois, that he opened a little grocer, kind of like a restaurant or whatever. And he died, I guess, from being abused. If you're an abused person, you become abusive. It's a cycle. And he died, according to my mother, from his wife. He had married a younger woman, and he would beat her. And I guess she got tired of it. And at some point, she mixed together some lye, and while he was sleeping, poured it into his ear, and he died. That kind of comes into play today with women being abused. It doesn't make it right as far as the family. She was never put in jail or anything for that crime. My Uncle Jim is the last thing. Uncle Jim Milligan. This is Milligan. And he has little pock marks in his face. You can kind of see. I never knew what they were. But he was like my favorite uncle. My mother didn't have any sisters and brothers. So I remember this gentle man. He was a very gentle person. And I remember he worked in Hot Springs and lived in Hot Springs. And he worked in the bathhouses. And he would come home. And as a little girl, maybe 3 or 4, I would sit behind him and just play in his hair and comb his hair. And he would never, ever say, just get away, little girl, or go mind your business or anything. He would just tolerate. He was just so very sweet. He died mysteriously in Hot Springs, either in 66 or 67. He had become a preacher. And Hot Springs, they were involved in the civil rights movement at that time. And according to my grandmother, and she couldn't tell that story either, because when you ask her what happened to Uncle Jim, she says they burned down his house. He was burned to a crisp. He was burned beyond recognition, and I could never get that story out. I'm currently trying to go through the death records of Arkansas to see if I can search to see when he died and how he died and was it ever investigated. That's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. There are so many parts to it, but I wanted to ask a question about your grandmother. I mean, certainly it seems that she was silenced, and I don't want to guess, by her sheer terror of this situation. Do you think she was able to then process the importance of the Supreme Court decision?
I don't think she was able to. My grandmother remained in poverty for the rest of her life. She was a domestic. She had some, I think, probably an 8th grade education. I don't think she knew how powerful that decision of the Supreme Court was at the time. She didn't know. And she never really could overcome that moment. Whenever you took her there, she could not overcome it. To even give you a semblance of what that story was about. You just got bits and pieces. Yes.
I was very moved by your presentation and your courage and your calm. And feeling the emotion generated from you sitting right in front of you, that is an amazing feat, and thank you. My question is specifically, I followed what happened to Uncle Albert and Uncle Jim. But Uncle Jim, you said in the beginning, became a witness carried out, the sharecroppers were condemned. I didn't quite understand it.
That's what I read when I first went online. I think it was the Phillips County newspaper, and they said one person came forward to name, because they kept naming people, but they said, as they were arresting them, but they said one person came forward out of those that had been arrested to give testimony, to say that yes, they did go out to kill the sharecroppers. The sharecroppers went out to kill the farmers, that they were planning an insurrection, and that they did kill the sheriff's deputy on the night of the September the 30th. And knowing what happened to him, knowing how he was tortured, I mean, a 15-year-old, really? The electric chair, beatings, whippings.
At that point, what was the family's reaction to him? Just as you said, he was young, he was tortured. You didn't hold it against him?
When I read that account that he was the person giving the testimony, I was a full-grown woman over 40, and I knew that he had to be pretty young because he was either a year older than my grandmother or a year younger than me. So I knew that he was a teenager. So he was just a child, and then with torture. Not realizing when I read that article that he was tortured, I had made the assumption at that time when I read that he was tortured. Gentlemen. It's gentlemen. First. And then I'll take you.
Thank you so much for that heartrending testimony. And Sheila, what do you want to leave your ancestors that follow you? What do you want them to know and learn about the Elaine Race Massacre? What do you want to communicate with them about this?
Number one, that it was an important event that happened in the United States. One that, like slavery, this country has not reconciled with. There were two important things that I got out of this whole thing in reading Bob's book. And one was that Scipio Africanus Jones was not recognized. It's not recognized in Black history, and he should be. He should be. The first book that I read, the NAACP kind of, the guy that wrote it was kind of like leaning towards some of the writings from the NAACP because they hired white lawyers, and he was the other lawyer on the case. But really, he was the person that was doing the footwork, the work. He actually worked this case. And the fact that he's not recognized, you can ask any African American, have you ever heard of Scipio Africanus Jones? And there's only one person that I know outside of my family who knows his name, that I asked that name to, and she says, yes, this lady's from Arkansas. She's was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And she says, yes, my father knew Scipio Africanus Jones, and he and my mother named their first child after him. So, and the second thing that I wanted to say about this case, why it's so important, and that's overall, is that the civil rights movement never would have happened the way it happened if it weren't for that case, the Moore versus Dempsey case. This is the young man right here.
How you doing? My name is Rashawn. Thank you, Sheila, for sharing your story. So my question is, Bob Whitaker mentioned a bit about some of the justice that came from the Elaine Massacre, and as you just mentioned, is that the case led into some of the groundwork for the civil rights movement and kind of the legislation that was used to pass civil rights law. But Chester also mentioned, and when I think about this concept of justice, I also think about reconciliation and how that plays. Chester mentioned a bit about his meeting you and what that meant for like reconciliation, for him coming to terms with this past. What did it mean for you?
It meant a lot to me. The afternoon that Chester and I met, I was looking out the window as Bob drove up, and I just started crying. I was just overwhelmed that here is a man raised in the South. We'd had a conversation already, but he actually wanted to meet me face to face. And how much it meant. How much it meant to me. I think as an African American whose forefathers were enslaved, people talk about reparations. I think the reparations for this country, for me as an African American, should be that whites, whether they were here when slavery happened, whether they weren't, but it happened in this country, and it happened to our people, should own up to it. Not own up to it and say, well, I did it, but it was something that happened in this country. And recognize that the way things are with my people, even though we have a black president, the way things are with my people, and I can use my family as an example. My mother was an only child, had 8 children, and out of those 8, I had a brother who was in prison for over 20 years. I had 2 sisters, 3 sisters actually, that were drug addicted, and they grew up in Chicago and lived in poverty. And one of the sisters, my younger sister who passed away, it's like it's just a chain. And I always feel, I tell my children, I feel that had they known this history in our family, maybe their outcomes in life may have been different. So I take Bob's book, I buy it for whoever wants to read it in my family, and I send it to them. Just hoping that it will change. It will just break the chain. I'm fortunate that my children broke that chain as far as the poverty and all the bad things that could go along with poverty. They're not involved. One more person.